I've always been, since my earliest years, what one would call an internationalist. That is, I pay attention to what's happening in other parts of the world, and as an internationalist, I'm thinking about life lived by other people all around the world. Of course, as an African American, I would love to spend some time in parts of Africa. But it's also true that I have many friends and loved ones in France. I would really like to bring my family, my wife, and my kids to come see our street in Paris. I think first would probably be the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, because, of course, while it was South African, it was also global, because it was the touch point of white supremacy versus the freedom and dignity of African people. So South Africa would certainly be a, logical first choice. But wherever people are fighting for freedom, that kind of whets my appetite and it gets my attention and moves my passion. The point of fact, I've spent most of my life, the bigger percentage of my life, on death row, and that cannot have had a profound effect on consciousness and on the way one sees and interacts with the world. I like to tell myself that I've actually spent a lot of that time beyond the bars and in other countries and, in other parts of the world, because I did so mentally. But, mental can only take you so far. The truth of the matter is I spent most of my living years in my lifetime on death row. So in many ways, even to this day, in my own mind, if not in fact, I'm still on death row. When I was a teenager and I was in the Black Panther Party, I remember going to downtown Manhattan and protesting against the political imprisonment and incarceration and the threats facing Angela Y. Davis. And I remember, of course, like many other Panthers, reading her works and finding when she attacked the prison system, she talked about the perhaps 250,000 or 300,000 people imprisoned all throughout the United States as not just a problem that needs to be dealt with, but a crisis, a situation that bordered on fascism. Well, fast forward 30, 40 years until the present, there are more than 300,000 prisoners in California alone, one state out of 50. The imprisonment in California, notice I'm not talking about the United States, but in California alone, exceeds that of France, of Belgium, of England, and perhaps I could name 4 or 5 other countries combined. So we could not perceive back then of what it would become, and so it's monstrous when you really look at what's happening today. You can literally talk about millions of people being part, that is, incarcerated by the prison industrial complex today, men, women, and children. And that level of mass incarceration, really mass repression, has to have an immense impact and effect on the outer community, not just among families, but in a social and communal consciousness way, and the inculcation of fear among generations. So it's at a level and at a depth that many of us could not even fathom or dream of today. There's never one thing. I mean, it's a sexy question, and I understand it, and I will address it. But the point is, because the system is a system of interconnectedness, and because one part of the system impacts another part of the system, and because what Antonio Gramsci called hegemony of the ideological system impacts other parts of the system, you can't change one thing that'll impact all things. I think, if anything, that's one of the lessons of the 1960s, because the civil rights movement was talking about, say, integration, this and that, and changing the schools. In point of fact, if you look at the vast majority of working class and poor black kids in American schools today, they live and spend their hours and their days in a system profoundly as segregated as that of their grandparents. But it's not segregated by race, it's segregated by race and class. Formerly class, which impacts race. The great Jonathan Kozol, who has researched American education for 40 years, has written in one of his most recent books that the American educational system is an apartheid system. I know from my personal interaction with my own family, talking to my wife and my kids and even the grandkids, that the schools that my grandchildren go to are worse than the schools I went to when I was in my minor years and in my teenage years. That's a condemnation of a system. But because former generations only concentrated on one thing or one side of the problem, the problems really got worse and worse and worse. And while there's a lot of rhetoric about schools, American schools are a tragedy. That's the only thing they can be called. Well, I would rephrase that. American schools in many of the black and Latino communities are not a tragedy. They are a crime. Well, let's look at it this way. If you look back at the COINTELPRO era, what is clear is that the FBI and their leaders and their agents knew that everything they did then was illegal. And FBI agents were taught and trained how to break into places, how to do what they call black bag jobs and that kind of stuff, how to commit crimes. But this is what they were also told. You better do it and you better not get caught, because if you get caught, you're going to jail and we'll act like we don't know you. You're on your own. What has happened in the last 20 and 30 years? Well, not just the NDAA, but the so-called Patriot Act has made everything that was illegal back in the 1960s and 1950s and 1970s, they've legalized it. They've legalized it. They've legalized the very things that FBI agents and administrators knew was criminal back then. That means they can look in your mail, they certainly can read your email, they tap your phones, they do all of that. But they do it in the name of national security. But they do it nonetheless. What we live in today is a national security state where Big Brother is legalized, rationalized. Nobody, frankly. I mean, let me put it this way. I have seen no one that I could, in good conscience, vote for today. Because most of the people that are out there are the two major political parties, and when they talk, all I hear is a kind of madness, an unreasonableness, a wish to return to days of yore, the 1950s. Or they talk about the perpetuation of the American empire, imperialism. My God, I mean, what is there to vote for? How many people consciously, when they go to the polls, are voting for imperialism, or voting for more war, or voting for their son or daughter or father or mother, for that matter, to become a member of the armed forces and become a mass murderer, bomber? I think it's the beginning of the kind of uprising, because it has to be deeper, it has to be broader, it has to address issues that are touching on the lives of poor and working class people. I think it has a ways to, but I think it's a damn good beginning. I just wish it was bigger and angrier. In the words of Kwame Ture, organize, organize, organize. And I love you all, and I thank you for fighting for me. Now let's fight together to be free.